My name is Annie Lewis. I am the Media and Communications Coordinator from Byron Shire Council, and I am your MC for today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, and I pay out my respects to them and elders past and present. Welcome and thank you to the Brunswick Valley Landcare Group, Wilsons Creek, Huonbrook Landcare Group, Goonengerry Landcare, and also Byron Shire Council for organising and hosting this workshop. The reason for the workshop, obviously, that's why you're all here, is to learn a little bit more about landslips. And I imagine during the break and prior to the start of this event, it's just sharing those experiences and catching up with each other if you haven't had that chance to do so already. Today you'll meet Dr. John Grant from Southern Cross University. John has COVID at the moment, so he can't be here with us, but thank you to the digital whizzes. He's going to be zooming in. I'm not quite sure about the question and answer session that he was supposed to do, so we'll work our way through that. You'll hear from Matt Bloor from Tweed Shire Council, who's going to talk to you about the experiences further north of the Byron Shire. You'll hear from Sean Morris from Local Land Services and Mark Dunphy and Stuart McDonald and their combined experiences in the areas of managing riverbank erosion and what plants to grow, things to think about and what plants not to grow on your properties. My job today is to keep things humming along. So to the speakers, if I give you a hurry up, please don't be offended. And to everyone else, there'll be time for questions. I'd like to take you back to the bushfires and the drought of 2019. If you can believe it, it seems such a long time ago, doesn't it? Well, at that time, people were wondering what to plant in their gardens and on their properties to be a little bit more resistant to drought. So with that, a grant from the New South Wales Government's Increasing Resilience to Climate Change Community Grants Projects program, the Climate Change Garden Book was born, and there's had to be a very quick pivot to also incorporate flood in that. But I'd like to welcome Liz Caddick, our amazing leader of our biodiversity team at Council, who is going to officially launch that guide.
I'm really excited to be here today to launch the Climate Resilient Landscapes Planting Guide, which, as Andy mentioned, has been supported by funding from the New South Wales Government and was initiated after the 2019 bushfires, when there was a real need in the community to learn and find out more about what plants we can plant to be more resistant to things like bushfires and other climate shocks. So this guide was developed by Brunswick Valley Landcare to help people to adapt to changes in our climate, learn what they can do, and help guide people to create habitat that is going to help our native wildlife survive through some of the extremes of climate that we're now experiencing. Brunswick Valley Landcare have done an amazing job. They've done heaps and heaps of research to develop this guide, which includes going out and auditing the past 10 years of plantings that they've done, and also looking in our natural bushland landscapes to try and work out what plants survived in the fires, what plants have survived in floods and recent storm events, and what plants were fed on by wildlife during the droughts. And what they've done is developed this guide that covers the whole of the Northern Rivers, so it's not just Byron Shire, it can be used across the Northern Rivers region. They've divided the landscape into 4 sections that reflect the habitats that we have here, so our coastal and estuarine areas, rivers and alluvial floodplains, foothills, hinterland, and then our higher ridges and ranges. If we take a look inside the guide, what it does for each of these different landscape types, you've got a list of local endemic native plants that the researchers showed are resilient to shocks in climate. And the guide also provides a whole lot of tips on how to improve the soil condition in your garden, how to manage water and water storage and water flows, and how to create shelter, all of which can help make your landscape more resilient. So for each of the different plants listed in the guide, we've got a whole lot of information on what they can do, whether they're drought, fire or flood resilient, whether those plants are good sequesters of carbon, whether they provide food or habitat for native wildlife, and whether they're salt, frost and wind tolerant. So there's a whole lot of information in there that can really help you work out what to plant to make your garden more resilient. The guide also contains a whole lot of tips on things like attracting wildlife to your garden, what specific plants you can put in to attract specific threatened species to your garden, and how you can landscape your garden to make it more resilient to flood or more resilient to fire. So there's a whole lot of information in there. I'm sure you'd all like to get a copy. So where can you get a copy? It's available for download in electronic form from the Brunswick Valley Landcare website, and we'll also soon have hard copies available at Byron Shire Council at the office in Mullumbimby. So we'll get that message out there when those are available. And if you want to find out a bit more about what the plants look like, growing in the wild, Brunswick Valley Landcare have also developed a climate resilient garden in Mullumbimby, which is just on Gordon Street between Maslin Arboretum and Heritage Park. So if you want to get out there and have a look, you can see how some of these plants are going and, you know, most recently how they've fared in our recent wet weather, and they're still going pretty strong. So yes, we don't want to say any more. I just want to thank Brunswick Valley Landcare for all the amazing effort they've done putting this guide together. It's going to be really important in the future, and I hope you all really enjoy it.
So when I was talking to Joe Green about this last week and about the purpose and the reason that the event was on, you know, we talked about Joe's experience at Huonbrook during that terrible weather at the end of February, and you know, and just about the feelings and the emotion, and you know, being at home and seeing all the water and knowing that it was really unusual to see so much water, and the amount of water coming over waterfalls, and then during the night, and how frightening it was. So the Landcare groups got together and decided that, I guess, for want of better words, that knowledge is power. We're not, you know, we've had landslips in this area before, but certainly not to this degree. So this forum today is about providing information, like I said earlier, to give you a little bit more knowledge about the land and landslips and what causes them and how they move. So our first speaker today is Dr. John Green. Sorry. Grant. Sorry, John. From Southern Cross. You can't hear me, John. I just pronounced your name incorrectly. So John is from Southern Cross University. He knows his landslips and he teaches soil, land degradation and rehabilitation. In 2003, John mapped, described and marvelled at soils from the southern tip of Tasmania to the islands north of Darwin. More recent research has led him through the Pacific and into Southeast Asia, always with an eye to the humble material under our feet that is responsible for the continuing existence of terrestrial life on our planet. After 30 years of describing tens of thousands of soil profiles and attempting to understand a little bit more of their complexity, he still finds them objects of wonder and beauty. Please welcome Dr. John Grant.
Okay, so hopefully people can see that. Yep. Okay. Okay, well, I wish I could be there. Unfortunately, one of the many disasters that have struck us since 2017 following the fire and flood and landslide is COVID, and that's just struck me in the last week. So I'm being restricted to home duties for a while. Anyway, I'd like to thank the organisers for allowing me to still participate, because I think this is really important that we discuss this. It's an issue that's affected a really wide range of people and a large area across the northern regions. And I mean, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you know, we still got to get a handle on how big an area and how many people have been affected. And really, this is, I don't like to say unprecedented, but this number of landslips that we've seen, it's just unbelievable. anyway, all right. So today I just really want to give you a bit of a background about the theory behind landslips, just to get some understanding of how they occur. And they're fairly simple mechanisms. And as a simple person myself, I'll restrict myself to those simple mechanisms. It gets a lot more complex once you get into the real world, where you get the complexity of a complex environment with vastly unknown. I mean, it's pretty hard to look below the ground, and that's where all of these events are being initiated. So it gets a lot more complicated out in the field, but I think if we understand the principles, it gives us a bit of a foothold of where we go in the future and how we explain this set of circumstances to ourselves and each other. So I'll talk about the mechanisms that underlie landslip. Then we'll look at prediction and a risk assessment. Because I mean, I think that a lot of us are pretty traumatized by what's gone on in landslip, and I think in order to move forward, we have to have an understanding that it's not a random event. Landslips have always occurred. Landslips are a natural part of the environment, but in the same way that fire is a natural part of the environment and erosion is a natural part of the environment, us as humans have changed those natural processes and increase their likelihood and increase their impacts. So landslide falls into that same category in that we have changed the environment and now we're paying the price for it. So I think having that some sort of risk assessment process helps us as well. Mitigation, how we can avoid and reduce that risk. Preparation for landslide, I'll talk about very briefly, and then some rehabilitation. I guess preparation is important in the same way as we prepared for fire. I think that we need to prepare for landslide, particularly under this changed climate that we're starting to see impact upon us. Mass movement or landslide, landslip, there's a whole range of different terms for this mass movement that occurs. I don't really want to get involved in the technical classification of different types of movement. We can have flows, we have falls, slumps, etc. They all fall under the same category of mass movement or landslide or landslip. It helps you to understand the difference between a debris flow and a slump, for instance. But at this stage, I don't want to spend a lot of time. But there are different mechanisms that are present, and in order to understand our own particular landscape, then it's worthy exploring those different terminologies, those different processes. But I don't want to go into it here today. So the impacts, of course, potential injury and loss of life, which we experienced here. I think that the biggest loss of life was the Thredbo disaster, where we lost 18 lives. Damage to infrastructure, loss of topsoil, exposure of subsoil. So I'm really a soil scientist, so I'm mostly concerned with the top part of the soil, the topsoil, and its relationship to the subsoil. Once you start getting into the lower parts of the soil profile, it tends to be less of interest to me because it's not part of the cycle of life in the medium to short term. However, when you start getting that entire profile disturbed and turned over, then that's disturbing to me as well. It's really important that our topsoil, our soils are protected because we're losing them too rapidly already. I mean, with the threat of climate change and everything else, really, unless we deal with the damage that we're doing to our soil, the human race is in trouble, regardless of climate change. So agriculture and the protection of our soils is really at the top of my priority list. So when I see landslides removing soil, dumping that soil into our river systems. That's really problematic. Now, I'll probably get onto my high horse a number of times. Just stop me if I start doing that, Alison. And yeah, off-site damage, and people have seen that. Their roads, their houses, their buildings, all impacted by landslides. So anyway, just go back to the processes that are in play. I mean, there is a fairly simple set of processes in play. That is, we've got mass movement is affected by slope, by the material strength, and by water content. So steeper slopes means that you've got a higher gravitational forces impacting down and moving that material off site, the cohesion of the materials themselves. So we'll call that regolith. So anything above hard rock is pretty hard to move unless it's fractured. So anything above the hard rock, we'll call regolith, just for the sake of argument. So the cohesion within the regolith, so at a microscopic scale, it plays an important role, but also the cohesion of the materials to the underlying rock material is really important. And then at the macro scale, how does all of that material, how is that all bound together? Bound together with roots, rocks, whatever. That's a really important determining factor when it comes to how it will resist and hold itself on a slope. And then a really big player is water content. So water content, and as we know, water content impacts upon a range of those different characteristics. Doesn't impact upon gravity, but the mass of the water plays an important role. So sometimes I often say that it's easier to think about not what makes land slip, but what keeps it in place in the first place. So we've got the cohesion at a micro scale where you've got forces between the soil particles, through to that macro scale stability, where you've got the whole unit, that all of that regolith, often supported by roots in a natural system, stopping it from moving off site. As gravity plays a really important role, steeper slopes. I mean, if we think back to our high school physics, the split of a force into two vectors, of course, as slope increases, then that downhill vector increases. So gravity doesn't really change. I mean, you don't have to tell me I'm trying to get out of bed this morning with COVID, and gravity was there waiting to hold me down, and they're grabbing me and forcing me back into bed tonight. So gravity doesn't change, although sometimes it does feel like it changes. Constantly there, wearing us down over time. Now, okay, I'll keep focused here. So that really is just a demonstration of the change in the forces with a steeper slope. Now, what can trigger a failure? Excessive rain, earthquakes. So excessive rain, of course, we'll talk about that in a minute. Earthquakes can input some energy into a system, and the input of energy can overcome the binding forces that are holding material on a site. Overloading and undercutting are really related to that macro scale force of the regolith holding itself together. Okay, the regolith is held on the slope by the frictional forces within the regolith, and also by the frictional forces binding that regolith to the underlying bedrock. If you add mass by overloading a site, adding mass onto a site, then that can overcome those frictional forces holding that material in place. How does that overloading occur? It could be by building on the site. It could be by adding a road onto a site. Anything that adds mass onto a site can lead to overloading. Water can lead to overloading. Undercutting means that you reduce the strength, the cohesive strength of that regolith sitting on the surface. Undercutting removes part of that support and allows a previously stable slope to move off site. So undercutting might be the introduction of a road, for instance, where you're slicing through, cutting through part of that regolith and removing its inherent strength. Water content plays a really big role because it adds additional mass. And of course, mass plays an important role. That's the force that's moving the landslide offside. It changes the cohesion of the micro cohesion within the site as well, and adds lubrication. So just as a demonstration, let's have a look at this example. So if you have dry sand is has low cohesion, and therefore it tends to hold itself together pretty poorly. But if you think about building a sandcastle at the beach, if you add water to it, then those sand particles will stick together. So water at low levels actually increases cohesion, because water is pretty sticky stuff at a microscopic level. So that example there on the bottom right, where you have the water holding the particles together, you have a more cohesive regolith when you have a slight amount of water. But then, if you then get to the point where you have a saturated soil, then the cohesive forces are overcome, and the materials then become quite mobile. So you've got two things occurring there. Number one, you no longer have the cohesive stickiness of the water being present, and you've got a highly lubricating environment. The grains are no longer contacting each other, and they're able to be quite mobile. The other thing that occurs is that you have a buoyancy effect. That is, the mass of the sand is reduced within the regolith itself. So therefore, I mean, it's a bit like, the buoyancy effect of when you're in water and you're lifted up in water, then you can move easily. It's much more easy to move something in water because the effective mass is reduced. So it's much more mobile, and that's exactly what's occurring, or one of the components of that water brings to a landslide, is that it increases the buoyancy, or provides buoyancy, and therefore allows the material to be taken off site. I mean, if you think about beach sand, for instance, when you're walking along the beach, if you walk along the dry sand, then the sand has weak strength. Your feet will press into the sand. There's not much cohesion there, and there's little cohesive strength between the particles. If you walk in the water where the sand is saturated, again, your feet sink into the water, into the sand, I should say, and because that sand has relatively weak strength as well. Where is the point at the beach where the sand has its strongest cohesive forces? It's where the waves have just left the beach, where the sand is wet, but it has drained sufficiently for those particles to be still nestling one upon the other, and with some water between those particles to provide cohesion. So the long and the short of it is that, once you get really wet surfaces, or potentially really dry surfaces, but in particular really wet surfaces, really wet regolith, then that becomes highly mobile. And of course, that's something that we see quite, that's what we saw in March, I guess. And this is what we're seeing in this case here. And there's a couple of factors that are playing a role in this example. This is a site where trees have been taken off site, and therefore the water content increases because trees pump a lot of water out of the soil. One tree can be sucking a couple of hundred, I'm going to say, gallons of water out of the soil each day. So once you remove trees off site, you're having that impact immediately. So that can lead to reduced slope cohesion due to that reduced transpiration and increased water content. Now, over the longer term, of course, roots within a slope provide a physical entrapment of the regolith. It's like a net holding that soil, that regolith together, and then binding it particularly with deep-rooted trees, binding it into the underlying bedrock. Now, trees provide what many engineers try to recreate when they rehabilitate a site using something like long rods to tie the soil down into the bedrock. I mean and that's exactly what we do when we build a house on an unstable site. Is we try to get down to the bedrock, and then we put pylons down to hold the house on that material. Roots provide that naturally by binding this material together. So we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of vegetation on site. Now, so on a site like that, the roots are still intact. They're still on the site. They're still doing their job, even though the site's been cleared. The transpiration has been reduced, so that will have an impact, but the roots are still there. Now, within 5 or 6 years, as those roots break down, then there's likely to be another suite of landslides that will occur on this site because you've lost that significant support for the site. And that can also occur with fire. And this is of concern, that an initial fire will remove an intense fire will remove vegetation from the site and stop the transpiration, so therefore lead to landslips in the short term. In the long term, after 5 or 6 years, then again the site becomes at increased risk of landslip because at that stage the roots are starting to break down, and this is quite a concern for areas that were experienced the 2017 fires. That landslide will become more common. The risk will increase as we start to see that those roots break down around about this time and for the next 5 years. Fire is problematic for a whole range of reasons. It increases surface flow. I saw a study where catchment flows increased 30 times following a fire in a catchment in Melbourne, which is a massive amount of increase, obviously, and there are erosion rates of up to 22 tonnes per hectare. And that sort of movement, that amount of soil being lost from a site is obviously tragic in its own right, but it's having a big impact off-site. And once you start getting those surface flows, that amount of water moving through a catchment, it can have its own impacts. And so one of the initiatives, a debris flow is a bit like a landslip. It's a fast landslip with a large amount of water, and it's generally confined to existing flow routes. So it might be a gully, or it might be a valley, or it might be a creek. A debris flow is a very rapid movement. It includes lots of material, rocks, soil, vegetation, and it's related to a landslip. In fact, a debris flow and a landslip is really on a continuum. A landslip is a wet soil or wet regolith moving, whereas a debris flow, it's around about 50% water, 50% soil material or even greater amounts of water. But debris flow, because they move very quickly, are really serious risks to anyone that is near or in a potential flow site. So that's something that I'm not sure how many debris flows occurred during the March event, but there's certainly a few of them. Probably not as many as the landslides, but they are highly dangerous because they move so quickly. And then, as I mentioned, the regolith is bound by the roots, and of course, fire impacts upon that as well. One other issue that I don't think that we've probably seen with fire is that it just does change the chemistry of the soil, and it increases the hydrophobic nature of the soil. And I don't think that's something that we've seen. I haven't been up into the national park enough, but so fire in native vegetation can cause the soil to become hydrophobic within or deep down in the soil, and then water that is flowing is permeating through a soil that then hits that impermeable surface, then starts to flow laterally. So you end up with a saturated surface layer over a hydrophobic layer, which remains pretty dry because it's hydrophobic. It doesn't like to absorb water. And so you end up with this saturated layer that can then slip off site. Now, this is not uncommon in Australia. I'm not sure that it is occurring in our area, but it's something that we should be aware of. So, as I say, vegetation increases the regolith strength, and it also serves to suck water out of the soils, which is really important. Trees are really good because they tend to have deep roots, and really tying regolith down into the bedrock is important. Sucking the water out from deep down in the soil profile and within that regolith is also really important. Some grasses, whereas grasses and herbaceous species tend to be surface rooted, and I think
Time warning, John.
Sorry.
Time warning.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I might have to shoot through a bit faster. I think Mark's going to talk about this. This is something that we really need to look at in detail, is how trees and which trees in our area are suitable for replanting these sites, which are most suitable, which trees are most have deep roots. I'm fearful that some species that are shallow rooted, some of our trees that are shallow rooted might be actually more problematic. They can increase mass on a site, which we already know is problematic, without getting roots deep down, and they might actually promote landslip. So I think that we need to really examine and look at in detail at some of these the species that we might be planting, and I think Mark might be examining that, and it's something that we do need to think about. Trees, or any trees on very steep slopes, can be problematic. So looking back to our thoughts about gravity and the way that gravity pushes, so the steeper the slope, then the more important mass is in determining the likelihood of landslide occurring. So if you're adding trees, heavy trees, onto a really steep slope, the mass can overcome, so the bad component might well overcome the good component of tying that material into the site. And we can see this in particular in rock falls, where you have roots that get into very stony, rocky cliffs and slowly wedge the cracks within that bedrock apart and allow that bedrock to fall. Now, sorry, I have absolutely messed up my timing, so I'm just going to shoot through and have a look at very quickly. This is all really good stuff, let me assure you. But what I really wanted to talk to you about is where we go from here. Okay, I wanted to show you that a picture of a slip, and to have you think about how do we deal with a slip where you've got this quite a broken landscape where you've got scarps, you've steep in changes in the what was previously an even slope into a completely uneven slope. So you've got very steep portions with cracks. You've got cracks that are transverse. You've got cracks that are radial cracks. So you've got cracks going in every direction. It means that what was previously a reasonable, consistent slope is now completely fractured, literally and figuratively. So you've got places within this new landscape that are going to act to concentrate water. So down below the steepest part of the site, and hopefully you can see my arrow there, then you've got a curve where water will now concentrate. And if you've got fracturing there, then water is penetrating into that part of the new landscape, and that's really problematic. No longer have you got consistent water entry. You've got a focus, and any focus that leads to a very high concentration of water within part of that landscape is more likely to initiate a new landscape. So we really need to think about returning. How do we potentially return this landslip into do we start to move some of this material to try to recreate a much flatter landscape? So removing the top scarp and flattening that out, and removing some of the main body of that landslip and replacing it to make it a more consistent slope. So I think that just in the same way that we have approached fire and flood, we need to think about the same sort of approaches to landslide. Number one, we're all starting to know now that we are at local risk of landslide. Previously, sitting up here in the upper parts of the catchment and the flood was coming, we were getting a bit smug about being away from floods. But this is not the case. And we need to know our local risk. We need to go out in rainfall events and see where water is flowing on our own properties and understand how that's going to impact, and make sure that we plan both private and public infrastructure to take into account that risk. We can't have roads closed every time we get a high rainfall event. We need to make sure our roads are well planned and our other infrastructure is well planned. Looking for signs of land movement. So assessing your risk is really important. And one of the biggest indicators of future landslide is past landslide. And it's getting your eye in to see that changes in landscape that indicate the undulations that indicate past landslides has occurred. Have emergency plans in place in the same way that we have fire plans. And plan in conjunction with your neighbours, because, of course, as we've seen over the last couple of months, the best thing that you can have in an emergency is a tight community. Sorry, and I've been talking through that when I didn't have the right slide up. So that's what I'm talking about there. So familiarise ourselves with the local risk, plan for the private have a plan in place and understand your risk. And some of those risks will be things like keeping red vegetation on site, ensuring surface drainage is appropriate so you don't focus water into parts of the landscape that then lead to problems. Where does your runoff, when your tanks are full, where does that runoff go? Where does that water get concentrated into the landscape? Is that going to likely lead to the initiation of a slip that then affects your property? All of these sorts of things. How are your retaining walls put in place so that they don't concentrate water into a certain part of the landscape and lead, or hold water that then will erupt out and lead to the initiation of a slip? Lots of things that we can do. The storm response, stay awake. Don't go to sleep. I tried this once and it didn't work. Because gravity doesn't sleep. I've also tested that. Sometimes I lie in bed with my eyes closed, pretend I'm asleep, and then jump up, but gravity's still there. It's still waiting for me. Gravity doesn't sleep. So unlike flood areas, we don't get an SMS telling us there's a really high rainfall event. So if we are expecting a rainfall event, and if we're there on site, then we can't really. Then you have to be aware yourself. Stay awake and be aware of what's going on around you for that night, because I mean, and I didn't. That's something I didn't do in the event. I mean, and when we woke up, we had this disaster that was happening around us. Consider leaving before a storm. It's really difficult to travel during a storm because our roads are highly susceptible to the impacts of storm, especially in the upper catchment, because our roads are continually cutting through slopes and therefore leading to the potential of slip. So traveling during a storm is really hazardous. If you're expecting a rainfall event and if you feel that you're in a high risk environment, then I think just like for fire, I think we should be considering leaving if it's safe to do so. And again, staying in contact with neighbours. Now, I think I've gone well and truly over time, so I'll just leave it at that.
What do you do on a massive area that is too steep to plant anything? What's the best way to handle that? A very big area.
So vegetation is only one of the control measures. So vegetation is about tying the regolith together and removing water. So you can always plant vegetation somewhere at the top of the slope before it gets steep, if you can, and at the bottom of the slope as it becomes less steep. Both of those will have an impact upon the overall slope. If you're planting material at the top, that's probably more effective in removing water than planting trees on the slope itself. So that will still take water out of the slope. And at the same time, you can remove water surface flows by putting in drainage. So subsurface and surface drainage, putting in a couple of very simple drains with by hand or with machinery, can remove water from site. So again, it's about removing water from the site. Surface or subsurface drainage, it can be an effective way to do that. Beyond that, you start to get into engineering solutions, putting in benching, starting to play around with the slope itself at a large scale, and that's beyond my area of expertise. But we have had some fairly good success in taking water across the landscape, putting in drainage channels, directing that water to a safe site. You have to make sure that the water that you're directing ends up within a part of the landscape that is not vulnerable, a robust part of the landscape, like a well-vegetated gully, for instance, to ensure that it doesn't create problems elsewhere. But that's probably the best thing that I could suggest.
So moving from slopes to streams, Matt Bloor is the Waterways Officer with the Tweed Shire Council. He manages the River Health Grant Program, which helps rural landowners manage and restore their creek banks to improve water quality and waterway health. He works closely with the community on a range of projects, from upper catchment streams to urban wetlands, with a focus on riparian vegetation, bank erosion stabilisation and regenerative land management practices. Matt has a lived experience too with this weather. Please welcome Matt, who's going to talk to you very quickly about what happened in the Tweed Shire.
I've got about 5 minutes to talk, and I really welcome this opportunity just to give a bit of context around what happened in the Tweed, some of our experiences, and I haven't had a lot of time to prepare for this, so it's a bit of an observation about what we experienced there in the Tweed, and pictures will tell 1,000 words as well, so I'll try and keep to time. I just thought I'd start with this slide just showing the flood hydrograph from the bomb site. In 2017, we obviously had Cyclone Debbie come through, and that was at the time the biggest flood event in the Shire and the region. But it was a much shorter event. So in the Tweed, in Yukai, where this gauge shot was taken from, 2017 was about a metre lower, and the flood peak was much shorter. So the impacts, while severe at the time, were nothing to what we experienced this. So we've had a much longer flood peak and a much higher stream power as well. This is a shot taken just a couple of kilometres downstream from Yukai. We lost about 40 metres of riverbank on this particular stretch of river, and this was fully vegetated. I believe in one of the other shots we'll actually see the previous condition of this bank from the air. So this was a site that we had planted up about 12 years ago with community. We'd been maintaining this site. We had a really solid riparian buffer along that stream. That's that section of riverbank, and the whole lot went in the flood. It was devastating to see. I nearly broke down when I stood there and took this photo. And we're not quite sure how we're going to rehabilitate it. So I guess the message I'm trying to paint here is that riparian vegetation is critical and important for all our streams, but we can't always rely on it, obviously, during these big events. Perhaps wider buffers would be important. If we managed to plant out another 20 metres, we'd still have a decent buffer. But unfortunately, as you can see with Kyogle Road to the right of that image, we don't have the room on some of these floodplain pockets. So this is an aerial image of the same shot. You can see over here, this is where the bank erosion was experienced, and the shot at the top is the vegetated bank beforehand. Interestingly, the reason I took this aerial image, put this in the presentation, was quite often during these high intensity flows we'll see erosion on the outside bends of the rivers and creeks. In this case, just due to the sheer volume of water, the erosion's happening on the inside bend, so it's taking out all those floodplain pockets, and essentially what the river's doing is trying to straighten here. So a straightened river equals increased stream power, increased sediment transport, and obviously the faster movement of water. So rehabilitating the Tweed River here is going to be a challenge because we've lost so much of these little floodplain pockets. We're losing the meanders in the river, and if we continue to see that the river straightening, we're going to have increased erosion both upstream and downstream in future events. This is a little further down the valley at Byron. You can see the impact of the floodplain scour here and the river straightening process. There's some barricades up here. This is Kyogle Road here, and we've lost 3 or 4 sections of road that's down to 1 lane now. And if this process continues, and it'll be a meander cut-off, so the river won't be meandering across the landscape as much. It'll be just pushing straight down through, which, as I said before, will increase the stream power and the sediment transport and during subsequent flood events. This is an aerial image of the Mount Warning Bridge, and I just put this in because I think it's really interesting just to see the sheer amount of sediment that has been deposited here. And what's happened here is the Mount Warning Bridge has actually obviously blocked up with sediment during the flood event, and then it's actually captured all that sediment behind it. So, our infrastructure can reduce the sediment transport system down the streams. And I think having natural sediment transport systems is really important. And the reason I'm talking about this is because possibly the weir on the Tweed River, which provides a tidal barrier so that we can extract water for drinking water, has possibly caused sedimentation further up the river. So while we think the Tweed River might be a really natural system, it's impacted, and the sediment transport system is impacted by that weir. And so we're just seeing a reworking of all that sediment, as well as what's coming down the catchment from landslides and other things. This is where I live, up Rollins Creek, and the same process is happening here. So this is one of our creek crossings that got choked with sediment during the flood event. The creek, essentially went around it and washed it away. And the reason I put this is you can see the difference in the bed height between the the bottom of the creek, below the old crossing and above. So all that material that's coming down the catchment from landslides is collected there, essentially in that where that stream was blocked by our creek crossings. And so that's interrupted the natural sediment transport system in our creeks. And so future flood events are going to rework all of that. And I really think that in this sort of setting, having like a bed level crossing is a much better option to allow that natural transport of sediment down the streams. This shot is taken on the Oxley River, one of the main tributaries of the Tweed, at Huonbrook on a floodplain pocket. This was after 2017, so I just put this in because the impacts were fairly similar on this site, but much more localised than the flood we've just been through. We had some funding available to do some restoration works after 2017 on this site. So we battered the banks back, we put in these pin groins, which allow water to actually pass through them, but they direct the flows back into the river, and revegetated the site. And I'll just skip to the next shot. And this was taken after the flood event this year. So the site, it was highly successful in stabilising that site. Obviously these works, very expensive, a lot of approvals and assessment and engineering designs, etc. involved. But, you know, also very successful. I must also frame this saying that we didn't get as much water coming down the Oxley River as we did in the Tweed. So while we might have escaped, you know, major damage during this flood event, possibly, next time we might see this site actually erode too. There's no guarantees in this area. This is another site we did on the Oxley River after 2017. We had a different approach here. Prior to our works, the bank that you can see was just a sheer vertical bank, so we had to batter that back, but we protected the toe with rock and root balls and logs. And it was also successful in holding up during this flood, but you can just see some scour on the downstream end of that site too. So we just have to really, you know, design these works really well and acknowledge that they're not going to hold in there forever, and probably trying to establish riparian vegetation is probably the best long-term approach. There is challenges in establishing riparian vegetation, as I said. We've lost a lot during the floods. A lot is lying down now and completely hammered or disappeared. I just put this in to show some of the challenges in trying to establish it. This was after 2017. We had drought, so we had to bring in water trucks and, you know, do a lot of work to actually get riparian veg established on this site. And I also put this shot in here just to show the fencing. Obviously fencing riparian areas is really important to keep stock off. Fence design is really important too. And we've had a lot of success just with 2-strand plain wire fencing, as opposed to your standard 4 or 5-strand barbed wire fencing. This last slide was one of our other sites. So we really try and do most of our restoration works involving vegetation. We don't really like to do hard engineering or even put in rock and other unnatural features on the toe of the banks. And I just put this shot in here to talk about vetiver grass. I know there's a lot of interest out there in lomandras and vetiver to try and stabilise creek banks. And in this case, we just planted vetiver along the toe of the bank and then revegetated further up the slopes. And it's been very successful in holding this site together. But obviously it's not going to work on every area. And there's a lot of crossovers between what John was talking about with landslips and stabilising banks, riverbanks, with mass movement of soil and vegetation, and sometimes having trees on the top of a steep bank is just adding to that extra weight too. So really need to consider planting arrangements for stabilising banks. And this is the last shot. I just put this in to show us this is the same site as the previous one where the vetiver was planted, and just wanted to show the successful establishment of the vegetation on this section of the Oxley River. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Matt?
Let's start up the back here and work down.
Yes.
1, 2, 3.
You mentioned the fence, Matt. That's two-strand. Yep. Electrified or unelectrified?
Yeah, sorry, that's electrified. Yep. And we like to use solar electric chargers because they can be moved around and taken away before a flood event hits.
I just wanted to ask if you have any suggestions about the obviously unnatural features such as bridges and roads.
Yeah, so a lot of our infrastructure wasn't particularly well planned as to where it was put, and that's why I showed a couple of slides around good design of creek crossings. And I believe Sean might talk about this a little bit more in some of his talk, but any landowner who is proposing these types of works really needs to be aware that you need to get a controlled activity approval to do this type of work to make sure it's really well designed and all these factors are considered. Obviously, infrastructure can have a major impact on the creek processes and riparian vegetation, and if things aren't designed well, then you can trigger instabilities and cause a lot of damage and erosion. I know a lot of you are probably landowners and, like me, walked around during the flood and watched it all unfold. I think that's using our observational skills is really important, when these big events are on, to actually go out and just see how the water moves and where the sediment's being blocked and where it's being scoured, and I think we can learn a lot from that. But good design is really critical for waterway health.
Hi Matt, I'm just wondering, you showed a slide at the beginning of Kyogle Road and the bend in the river, and showing how the river was trying to find the straightest route towards the sea, which was on the, I guess what you'd say, the inside of that horseshoe, of that bend. Is that a tendency in terms of when a river's trying to find a straight line? Is that sort of inside curve of the horseshoe the most vulnerable side of the river, or is it sometimes the outer bank of the horseshoe? Yeah,
normally it's the outer bank because that's where the deeper part of the channel is, and that's where the water's been concentrated, during low to medium flows. But during high flows, I guess the water's just spilling out, and usually those little floodplain pockets are, establishing on the inside bends because that's where the material's dropping out normally during a flood event. So during a big event where there's so much water, it's just pushing through. They're the vulnerable bits. The outside bends obviously are as well, but in that case on the Tweed River, there's the hard rocky valley margin, like the hill slope there, so it can't go that way. So the water's just pushing and taking out all those inside bends.
This is a question from my own observations of what's been going on in Maynarm and attempts to restore where huge amounts of water have straightened. And my observation is that sometimes they're getting in there with bulldozers and whatever, and they're actually straightening and creating T-intersections where smaller creeks come into the Brunswick River. I find that really concerning, that they're removing the curves that slow the water and creating situations with a T-intersection that are going to, in further flood events, are going to create much greater destruction. It worries me.
Yeah.
What can be done? People are trying to repair things quickly, and not necessarily with enough knowledge about water flow and stream.
Yeah, that's right. Look, a common reaction is just to get in and put a machine in and get access again, or to fix up your creeks or get the water flowing away from your roads and all that sort of thing. It's not actually allowed. You're not meant to just put a machine in a creek without getting approvals first. The approvals are quite stringent, but that's why they're assessed at such a high level, because straightening creeks you are going to increase the stream power and the sediment transport and the erosion process. I suppose after this flood event, people have just been doing it and everyone's scrambling to fix up their roads and creek crossings. So I don't blame people for doing that, but having an understanding of riverine processes is a really important thing, and keeping that creek meandering takes a lot of stream energy out and allows sediment to drop out and allows the natural sediment transport process to occur. So it is a worry, and I know in Queensland they've done a lot of river straightening processes works to convey flood water away quicker, but it's just caused a lot of problems. So we need to try and keep our rivers as natural as we can. including the upper catchment streams.
Sorry, Matt, just one question. In trying to keep our rivers as natural as possible, just interested in your choice of vetiver as opposed to the mangrove.
Yeah. In that case, it was a bit of a trial. We had a toe on the bank that we couldn't. This site we did a lot of earthworks on because the bank was about 6 metres high and sheer, vertical bank, and so it was just slumping in, similar to a landslide. Really, it was that sheer mass movement. So we batted it back, and we had to leave a toe about 2 or 3 metres high. And vetiver has a really deep root system, so we trialled that along the toe. If we can get the vetiver roots to go down 2 or 3 metres into the soil and lock in that toe while all that vegetation establishes, then we determined that was worth the risk. Vetiver itself, this variety that we use, and other people probably got a lot of experience with it too, is a sterile plant, so it doesn't seed. Yeah. So it's got no risk of actually becoming a problem. And then after a while, the vegetation shades it out, and the vetiver, dies back.
2 more questions. We've got the gentleman there with his hand up, and then this lady just down here at the front.
I've got a creek on the property and big boulders which will do this Upper Wilson's Creek, all washed away. Am I better restoring it to that angle or restoring it back to they're all washed away?
I'm not really an expert on that, but just thinking about what John was talking about, having less of a steep slope, you've got less gravity and less weight, so you're less likely to actually get like a mass movement. But it's complex, and if you've got water moving through your soil profile and a whole range of other factors and different depths of soil, it's hard to answer that question. But
it's a flat area, but with a wall to the creek, and am I better just planting vegetation, the deep-rooted vegetation, and not restoring the water?
Yeah, I think you really need to get, everything's site-specific, so you need some advice on that. But, battering your banks back to a more stable grade often allows you to get that vegetation established, which is why we do that. Mostly on alluvial soils, though. I don't know about further up in the catchment where it's a bit steeper. It depends on your soil type. It might hold in there even though it's really steep, possibly. Yeah. If it's rocky, it might hang in there a bit better.
Hi. On the question of advice and approvals, a neighbour has had a landslide that has dumped substantial trees and soil into a named creek. And when I phoned the council and then roused water, each party said to contact the other. And it's really difficult to actually know who to talk to about, having this solved. So where should we start?
Yeah, good question. Usually there's multiple approvals required. So it is Natural Resource Access Regulator is the government department that gives you a controlled activity approval to do in-stream works, so soil removal or any kind of even earthworks and other things like that.
What if the neighbour's not interested in doing anything about it and it could potentially block the creek?
So I don't know if you'd actually get. They're not really an advice agency, so they'll assess approvals, but they won't actually give you advice. So it might be something that maybe Sean can answer in terms of local land services. I believe they're offering some assistance to assess and streamline some approvals processes, so that might be a good way to segue into Sean's talk. Yeah, sorry, I can't answer that one too easily, but yeah, approvals are required, including Department of Primary Industries and Fisheries, to remove material. They consider it to be dredging, so any of that work does need approvals.
Would dredging in a creek that supplies water be the responsibility of the water owner, so RAPS or whoever's selling it on? Or is it the landowner?
It's probably the landowner itself, but they can't just go and do it. They need to drive the process and get the approvals. And it's a complex area, and it can be a bit frustrating, even for myself. And I work in this area day in, day out, and yeah, the assessment's quite stringent, but I guess that's all designed to, you know, to protect creeks and the environment. I've probably gone a bit over time, so I better sit down.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Matt. That's really
Sean Morris from Local Land Services, who I think just walked out there. Sean, I hope you're not going to the toilet. Has almost 25 years of experience in natural resource management. He has a reputation as a leading practitioner who can design and supervise projects that improve primary production systems and increase ecosystem resilience while also providing social and/or economic benefits. He holds an advanced diploma in applied environmental management and a master's in natural resource management with a focus on sustainability, ground and surface water management. He is recognised as a certified environmental practitioner in the fields of applied geomorphology, aquatic resource management and fisheries conservation. Sean's come up from Coffs Harbour, so thank you very much for making the trip up here and handing you over.
Hi everyone. Let's do a quick little survey. Eh? Who's got erosion on their property and needs some help? Okay. Who's river on erosion or landslides? No. Okay. Down the bottom of the catchment or up the top? Top. Most up the top. Okay. Who's here for the free catering? Young fella, put your hand up. Okay, so I'm going to do my best with this, but bear with me. Questions at the end, if we can. Try not to stand in front of the speaker. If you've got a yes, no, quick question, I don't mind trying to answer it, but try and save it at the end. It'll be the benefit of everyone, I think. Okay, so I work with the Natural Assets Protection Team for Local Land Services. I'm very lucky, and some of those team members are here today. We've got a range of specialists from terrestrial ecologists, aquatic resource managers, and I kind of fit into that gamut of river restoration. So we're going to cover a few things today. The things I won't talk about: civil disputes, compliance, unapproved works, insurance claims, non-best practice. So there you go. Just kidding. I'm going to talk very briefly around approvals. I'm going to try and cover those as best I can, but if there's a specific question, try and wait to the end. In terms of approvals, fisheries for the Dredge and Reclamation Act. So if you're taking material out or putting material back in, that triggers the Fisheries Management Act. Controlled activity permit is through the New South Wales Water. Same type of thing. If you're putting anything in the river or taking something out, you need that work permit. You may also need a DA, depending on what your local council says. And if you're if you're bed of the river or if you're in the marine waters, you'll definitely need a Crown licence as well. Okay, so there's a few processes. I'm going to try and kind of give you some tools to kind of take home and think about. Geomorphology is an observational science, so you can really start to pick up over time changes, and those changes will help you understand what kind of intervention you need. Generally though, these things take time, and we've got to look at them in the right context. We are here in a very minor little snapshot of time, okay? Rivers have formed over millions of years. We can't always go back in time, but we also don't want to go too far down the road that we start actually working against ourselves when it comes to river restoration. So I'm going to talk about a few theories and also explain a few kind of concepts, and then we'll move on to some case studies. Okay, so some of the more common processes that you'll see, the one that is probably the most common after this flood especially is the drawdown effect. So John spoke about buoyancy, and so obviously once the floodwater comes up, that's fine. River seems to be okay. Once that water level drops, it's lost its buoyancy. If the material is too steep, it'll start to fall in. You can see that in floods, but you can also see it in the tidal range as well. Bank slope, so I'm going to bang on around the same things that John spoke around angle of repose. So when I say that, that's the material angle that it would sit if it's lying in a depot somewhere, okay, from rock to sand, whatever. That bank slope is generally going to dictate what kind of outcome you get, whether it's slumping or sloughing, and there's a couple of examples there. Up the top, you've actually got scour. Down in the middle, you've got undercutting, and down in the bottom, you've got a combination of slumping and sloughing. It's good to try and recognise those different types because it will dictate the type of work that you do. Lack of vegetation and complementary root matrix. I'm going to bang on around roughness. If you haven't heard around what roughness is, I'm going to really get into that because it's imperative that we understand the value of roughness. Wind and wave wash, of course. Outside bend helical flows. So as that water passes around the bend, it actually builds in power. And quite often the biggest power source of that water power is actually the bottom end of the riverbank. Not the start of that bend, but down the bottom end. Opposing inside point bar accretion. So all our rivers kind of move side to side and actually move down as well. So sometimes that inside point bend will aggregate and wants to push outwards, and that's where you often see erosion on an outside bend. Bed lowering and subsequent bank failure, they're big ones. So whenever that stream bed drops, right, the banks will collapse around that drop in bed level as well. It's exacerbated by stock access to the riparian zone, weeds, shallow roots, fencing along the bank crest only, or no suitably wide buffer. Outcomes are basically those three types of effects that we see. The top right, very, very common up around Lismore. A lot of stripping occurred in there, in Scour. Lots of slumping and sloughing as well. A lot to do with the drawdown effect, but also steep banks, isolated trees, too much weight, and it goes. Slide. So my biggest worries that we look at to try and make sure that we keep on the ball of where the priorities are in a landscape are those bed control head cuts. A hanging tributary or a flood runner, so you might have a main stem of the river and then you have another tributary coming in. If that's hanging and starting to adjust to that main stem, it will just keep moving. It will keep adjusting. And they're big ones for us to worry about because you're going to lose so much sediment and potentially straighten the river. Meander cut-offs. Now this is a site I've worked on for nearly 10 years around the upper Arara, Karangi kind of area. The blue line was the old river pathway. That yellow line was the meander cut-off. So essentially shortened that river from 3 kilometres down to less than 1 kilometre. With that, you increase slope, you increase sediment movement, you increase erosion. They're the big ones for us to worry about. It's taken 10 years of a variety of works to get that to a point where we're actually moving water back around that 3 kilometres of river. Floodplain stripping, it's the start of the meander cut-off in some instances. So we saw in our previous chats where you have an inside point bend and water is moving across that inside point bend and it's stripping away that top layer of material. If that continues to go down, it turns into those meander cut-offs. Okay, again, a straightening event, something we really want to watch out for. All of those features generally work towards some kind of straightening. Slide. A couple of local examples. This was really helpful for Joe to send these to me because just to get an idea of like the degree of the issue that you guys have up here. The material on these two riverbanks basically brought back to virtually, you know, the coffee kind of rock layer underneath it. That suggests discharge exceeded the sheer strength capacity of that material, mobilised it. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. The other one on the right, look at the size of that material that's being transported. We've got boulders like this. Now, to be able to move a boulder like that takes a lot of power. And of course, infrastructure being placed right next to it, like that road, without that tensile strength in that riverbank, which we've all spoken about for the last hour, you're going to have some kind of impact. Slide. Albert Park, so this is just near Lismore, mass scouring right across the face of the riverbank. Generally an indicator of discharge exceeding roughness, okay? Now I'm going to talk a bit more about roughness, so don't panic just yet. Great example of how trees, riparian veg, can be undermined and literally just sloughing down into the toe of the bank. Again, a couple of processes there, draw down, scour at the toe, excuse me, and isolated trees without an interconnected matrix of roots that complement one another. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of theory. Thalweg, deepest part of the river, always on the outside bend most of the time. That does create issues, but it's a natural part of how water moves around an outside bend. It's just the inertial force of that water building as it's being forced to take a turn. I mentioned before helical flows. Helical flows, just try and imagine a barrel tumbling on multiple axes, okay, as it's moving along that stream edge. And that's how you get that scouring effect of water eroding against your bank face. So as I mentioned before, many rivers migrate laterally side to side, but longitudinally, so they shift downwards as well. Often the goal is to shift that thalweg, that deepest part of the river, away from the toe of the bank, and we do that with deflecting structures. That's another way of kind of trying to stop that scouring and the loss of material at the toe of your bank. A general rule of thumb is that if you're looking after the bottom third of your riverbank, it's generally going to be reasonably stable. If it's exposed, there's no roughness, too much force is being applied to it, it will undercut, and those processes that we just spoke about will take place. Angle of repose. I'm glad John's covered this, but it is important to understand what that angle of repose means for your property. So just imagine sand in a depot sitting there, if it's been dumped out of a truck, sits nice and in a nice pointed little pyramid. And in one of John's slides, you can see with that rain coming down, it just turns flat. Now, if that same material was, say, cobble or rock, it would actually maintain its shape, okay? It would stick it at, say, 45 degrees. So when we look at a riverbank that's heavily eroded, quite sheer, it's always going to erode if that material is not sitting at an angle of repose that it's used to and able to actually maintain its shape. The only way you can influence that is by shaping it or interconnected matrix of roots that actually hold that profile together. So part of the reasoning here that how do we respond to that erosion is actually we increase that roughness, we increase the shear strength of that riverbank, right? The material wants to be mobilised by water, how do we stop that or slow that down? And or we provide a suitable angle of that bank to actually make sure it's stable. So when we talk about battering, that's what we're doing. We're actually taking that sheer nature of a steep riverbank and turning it into a slope or an angle that a material likes to rest on, especially when wet. Okay, so a little bit of theory, but if we take one thing out of today, it's Lane's balance equation. Now, try not to think of this as too much maths in your head, but up the top right, we've got equilibrium. On the right-hand side, we've got discharge. On the left-hand side, we've got roughness. What's roughness? Well, it can be logs, it can be rocks, it can be the material of the bed, it can be the angle, it can be the shape of that outside bend or the sinuosity of the stream. All of those things contribute to roughness. Now, in the case of the bottom right, we're in a scenario which is actually quite positive. It's a grading. Why? Because discharge is not being exceeded. Sorry, I apologise. Roughness is exceeding the discharge rate. Now, what we just experienced is the complete opposite of the bottom right picture. Discharge, extremely high. Roughness, extremely low. Nowhere near equilibrium. So part of our management practice has to be is restoring roughness, restoring the things that allow erosion forces to be dissipated, okay? So I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but the one thing I want you to take away from today is when you go home and you look at your riverbank, think about the sheer stress that's exerted on that bank material. How do we actually kind of consider that site in terms of the context of that and do the improvements that we need to actually provide some stability? The things that can actually affect that, as I mentioned, soil vegetation, channel curvature and armouring to basically resist that erosional force. There's, whenever we look at high kind of scale geomorphic studies, we always look at what is the flow rate that bed material starts to be mobilised at. That's when a lot of triggers and a lot of thought processes around roughness take place. Natural erosion, generally around less than 5%, 5 centimetres a year, don't quote me on that, but I remember that reference from somewhere. But you'll see accelerated erosion, man-made or induced erosion, around that 20 centimetres or so per year. That, again, anything above 5 and you've got reasonable roughness, you should start to worry about there might be other things going on. Okay, great, thank you. This is analysis of bed slope within the river. Okay, so that yellow line on the bottom represents a very heavily wooded stream, lots of large woody debris, okay? You'll note, just some of the old timers might say, oh, that looks so messy. You've got to clean that up, get rid of that, get the water flowing. But that is the one thing that's actually dissipating that energy. And instead of it going out to the side, it's actually going down and tumbling. And so you'll find a well-wooded stream is quite narrow and quite deep. And that's what we used to have. That was the common type of riverine feature that we would have, because back then they weren't pulling out snags, and we didn't have stock grazing right to the channel edge. Okay, we had continual supply of wood in stream. That provided the roughness. That's what slowed things down. That's what provided nice deep pools and habitat for fish. On the right, heavily degraded, no benthic complexity. All the power is being shifted out to the edges, okay? And you've got a sediment slug there. Benign, very useless, almost, aquatic habitat. That's what we want. That's what we want to avoid. Okay, so river styles framework. We just want to touch on this, but I do want to get across that there's 50 different river styles in New South Wales. Even in the Bruns, we get most of those river styles occurring, right from the very top down to the bottom. When we look at restoration, we need to look at some kind of framework, give us something to actually guide us on our little pathway to restoration. So there's some key principles to consider. We want to respect river diversity. We want to work with its behaviour, not against it. We want to have those linkages with biophysical processes. Things like understanding what a fish needs can be quite critical. I'll explain why in a sec. We want to use geomorphology as an integrated approach for river management. So a little way of shortening that out, one, river character and behaviour. What's the condition? What's its recovery potential? And what kind of applications can we provide in each of those unique settings? Every river and every site is a little bit different. If you own riparian land right next to a river, there's a great book, Kirsty Fry's and Gary Briley, Geomorphology and River Management. It's worth paying for. It's like, you know, if you're a plumber, you'll have your technical notes, and that for riverine works or anything to do with management is our technical guide. Okay, just to try and explain river styles a little bit easier, we're looking at the top of the river, the catchment, down to the very bottom. Up the top, you can have a confined setting, so gorge almost. Then you can have a partly confined setting with discontinuous little floodplain pockets, very common. As you move down, you'll have lateral controls, but they're quite further apart, and there's actually a continuous floodplain, all the way down to virtually an open valley setting, okay, which is basically once you're kind of into the marine kind of delta or floodplain kind of tidal area, you'll start to see that happening. That is a great little tool for you to know why you're seeing erosion where you're seeing it. And it also says that power is high at the top, not so much down the bottom. So if I need to do works up the top, I might need to use a little bit more rock. I might need to really work on friction as something that I want to try and concentrate on. Down the bottom, maybe I can get away with using logs a little bit more often. Okay, importance of veg. I'm going to talk about temperature. Temperature is important for a number of reasons, but really the guts and guts of it is that if you look at the slide on the right, you can see that vegetation has a role depending on its width. Okay, so first 5-10 metres, organic input will be suppressed. 15 metres of revegetation, stabilisation, not 5, not 2. Water quality and flood control, 15 to 30. Okay, these are quite wide areas. Habitat, 25 plus. Take account for connectivity for animals literally to be able to move themselves from one section of the river all the way up to possibly a different river style. Now, look at those two condition settings. That's what we want. That's what we've got. We're going to basically transition these open, hot, very benign habitat settings into something that's actually functional. When will we know it's functioning? Is when we start to see these types of elements come into our cross-sectional profile. Deep, complex roots, a deeper V in this channel shape, less sediment, no grass right up to the edge of the bank. All these things relate back to roughness. That's got roughness, that's not. That's going to erode at 20 centimetres a year, that might at 5. So the Goldilocks theory is, when I've done these talks overseas, the geomorphologists are actually entomologists. They use insects as their indicators of river health. Here, we've still got our fish, whereas Europe basically has lost most of their important fish species. And so we can use fish that have been around for 10, 20 million years as our bioindicators of riverine health. Everyone would have heard that a frog is a good indicator of water quality. Well, fish are a good indicator of river health. So a hot, open riparian habitat that we saw before versus that closed, cool setting, big difference in fish numbers between those two types of habitats. And I'm trying not to beg on this, that no one likes graphs, but I love this one because on the bottom right, you've got temperature, top right, side to the left, you've got its life stages. Now you'll see both the spawners and the embryos can only tolerate a very narrow bandwidth of temperature. As they're juveniles and adults, they can obviously tolerate a little bit more, but we need those cool rivers to basically allow for recruitment and spawning to occur. If we're not doing that, then we're breaking the chain of a 20 million year old species. And I see it happen all over the place. There's localised extinctions of catfish, rainbow fish, galaxids all over the shop. It's only because of this and this discontinuous nature of riparian country, okay? These are the sites where if you've got that hot environment, they'll generally get phone calls from them. I generally don't get phone calls from the guy who's got riparian condition of a really complex nature both sides of the river. Look how pretty they are. I mean, come on. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, these are all 10 plus million year old species. They've been here for that long, longer than us. They tell us what they need. Well, what do they need? These guys need high quality water, no sedimentation. They lay sticky little eggs on the bottom of the gravel. So any sedimentation is going to cover them and kill them. So we need to make sure that we're not we're poorly managing our erosion site. Purple spotted gudgeon, same type of thing, but they need fringe vegetation. They need that lamandra sticking over the stream edge to hide underneath. Often I'll go snorkeling and I won't see them anywhere. Just tuck my head underneath that lamandra and there'll be 50 of them there. Fringe vegetation. Top right, bass. He needs to be able to move right down to the bottom, to the ocean virtually, and come back up to the steep slope. So managing bed controls, making sure that there's no major changes in hydrology, critical for that species. Those threats you could probably list just briefly in this way of sedimentation, loss of fringe veg, loss of macrophytes, so underwater vegetation, loss of microhabitat, and changes in those water qualities. Now, it's not all for nothing. So on the left, you can read that at your pleasure, but these are just different examples of where the things that we're talking about, maintaining riparian veg, fencing, making sure you understand stream power and roughness, these are all the outcomes of that. What we try and get across to you is that, yes, your effort is quite high at the beginning. It will actually drop down over time. Your resilience, though, can actually be increasing with your drop in effort. So what we try and say is, in this context, is keep going. You might not see a lot of fruits of your labour for the first 5 or 6 years, but once you get into that 10-year time frame, your resilience level will increase. It's worth the effort. We'll basically be trying to stabilise your riverbank, but provide all those niche habitat conditions that our lovely fish need. Short-term things that we can do. Well, get rid of your stock off the bank. Okay, I get these phone calls all the time. What's your stock doing at the moment? Oh, he's just still in the water. Well, get him out, for Christ's sake. Monitor for weed intrusion. Big ones that we look for, tropical soda apple, but really any weed that's like a camphor or something that's going to be a pioneer and suppress the natural recruitment of vegetation that should be in your seed bank. If you've got exposed soils, get some ground cover on that straight away. Hand broadcast some native seed. Just get something on there to stop and slow that down. If you've got erosion, 1 metre back from that point, around that bend, dig in some pegs and watch it for 6 or 12 months and try and understand that rate. Is it high, like that 20 centimetre that we spoke of, or is it really not that bad? Is it closer to 5? And look, we've got some great guys out the front. That one bottom right, looking after waterways in the Richmond, it's a cracker. It's got so many great tips into it. I know there's not a lot of copies, but you can download it via if I just type in that name into Google, it'll pop up. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly, and I probably will go over time, but I'm going to go through some case studies and just give you some context. Now, again, another great guideline, design guidelines for the reintroduction of wood into Australian streams by Dr. Andrew Brooks, talks about how we can use wood. Again, I'm like, sorry, it's Matt, isn't it? Yeah, I'm like Matt. I don't like using rock, but I've got to sometimes, generally to protect assets. But if I do, I'm going to be bringing in wood and as much other composite material that's friendly to fish as possible. So if you have to use rock, bring into that methodology some complexity. Now, I know that might be, it's very expensive and we might not be doing it, but I do want to get across a couple of points. The way we're doing it now, and we're trialling, is we're making our rock far more convoluted and corrugated. We're trying to provide much more complexity in that rock bank face, velocity shadows, allowing tidal movement to move in between the main stem and into your adjacent riparian lands. We're adding in complex habitat at the bottom. Yes, those reef balls are concrete, but we use a neutral concrete that allows growth to form over them, and fish just absolutely love them. We've used snag hotels in this rock complex as well, so you can see the shape of these on the bottom right. There's 100 of those in Emigrant Creek. These works all survived the floods. But again, you may not be doing this. I'm just trying to invoke on you to move forward from these older designs of a benign, homogeneous type of erosion control setting into something that actually functions for the fish that actually occupy that water. This is from the Clarence River following the flood, I think 2014 or 15. Same types of issues that we're seeing up on the Clarence. But again, you can see one of the key things, we are battering the bank back, getting it to a slope that it can handle being saturated. We're protecting that bottom half of the bank, the most susceptible part of the bank, but we're providing the means for habitat and vegetation like macrophytes to grow around that toe, far more friendlier than just rock. Again, here's a little example of a big eddy. Again, we've had to use rock, can't get away. The erosion powers are just so strong, geomorphic issues that we can't let go, but we're going to bring in pins and other types of structures to actually make it just a little bit more friendly for fish and a bit more functional as well. Like Matt, I love using pins, and I think if it's the cheapest option that you're going to have up here, it's going to be using pins. So forestry thinnings you can get quite easily. You know, for a truck that might have $1,000 worth of pins in it, you can get a machine for a couple of days. All of a sudden, for $5-6 grand, you can actually do a reasonable amount of works. Why do these work? Roughness. That is just mimicking how water would pass through a forested area. And we're actually providing the means for that bed material that's tumbling along, and I mean quite large bed material, to stop and slow down, stay in place. I like these types of works, and it's probably where I think Matt's showing that we're heading in that direction. I'll show a couple more examples briefly. I know I'm going over time. Here's a couple of examples where we want to try and reinstate sinuosity, the curvature of our stream. And you can see again, you don't have to use a lot of these pins to actually restore that sinuosity. Here's just a couple of examples of how you can apply that to make sure that you're not going to have a straight river, okay? The photos in the next slide are probably a little bit clearer, so we might go to that one. Again, you can see how we're using them to actually deflect flow, but slow flow down and promote deposition at the same time. Top right, log jams. I haven't really covered those, but look, about 15, 20 years ago, the Canadians pulled apart those log jams, okay, and they understood how they all interconnected and locked together. We now use that as a form of deflection, so moving that thalweg away from the eroding bank, but providing that habitat at the same time. That's probably best practice example for riverine management works at the moment is the use of log jams. Can't use them in every case, in every part of the river, but where we can, we certainly will. Again, steep eroding face, what do? Batter it back, create complexity along the toe. Underneath that fringe of rock there, we've got huge logs. Every time I go snorkeling in there, I scare catfish and bass and mullet that are hiding underneath. That's the difference between just using crappy old rock in one straight line and actually thinking about it and conjoining your need of river management with fish life or aquatic life. Again, another type of work with log jams. You can see that we space them apart in such a way that they complement one another. So we basically, either side of that log jam, you'll get deposition, where that deposition generally would finish is where we would start another one, so that they complement each other as water moves around that outside bank. Here's an example from the Bruns down the bottom of the estuary. Steep bank. What are we going to do? We're going to knock that back to a slope angle that's actually going to be suitable for that bank material to rest on. Then we're going to put in some of those pin structures that we spoke about and re-veg the hell out of it. It's the only way that you can get back some form of stability without negating the habitat value of a site like that. And when we talk about approvals, even I have to do a DA for that. So I understand how difficult and challenging it can be to get something off the ground, but we all have to play the game. Here's one from Emigrant Creek, a corrugated design primarily to deflect boat wash. But again, just think a little bit outside the square. Straight lines in nature don't necessarily exist. If we can provide the means for deflection, we can, in this case, actually grow a mangrove nursery. And we're also collecting deposition at the same time. I had 600,000 mangroves in that nursery before the floods. I've now got about 50,000, but they will come back. They'll come back in July and also in December of this year. 2 different species will drop and they will colonise behind that structure because it creates slack water. There's a little bit of a time frame. Horrible big steep outside bend on the left, and over time you can see the recruitment taking place. Now it's a functional marine riparian stand. A couple of bed control examples where I spoke before about that head loss. There's a great example of a head cut, and now to actually fix that we need to create a ramp, dissipate energy and connect up those 2 bed levels from the top to the bottom. Next slide. You can do this a little bit more in the upstream environment. This is an example of a chain of ponds restoration, a V-shaped channel. Over time, we want to collect as much deposition so the structure actually buries itself. Okay, that means that we're raising the floor, we're actually increasing its capacity to store bed material. How can we get help? Well, first of all, don't do that, please. Where you put your fence is critical to how your riparian habitat functions. How your riparian habitat functions is critical to how your bank works. But, of course, we're always available. Give us a call on 1300 number. We will ask for photos. It's very difficult for me to provide advice on the phone about general theory because it'll be like this talk, but I need photos. So if you've got a site of major concern and you've seen the types of sites that worry us the most, give us a call. Your information will be logged. We'll have that on record and we will store your photos so that when money becomes available through the bigger programs that we've got, we have access to that information. But really check the website because our website's going to be the one source that will tell you if there's, for example, a grant program that's available. I think that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean. Time for some very quick questions, maybe 3 questions. I'll start over here.
If there's any hard ones, I'm going to give them to Matt.
Sean also will be here over lunch as well, so you can grab him then if you don't get your chance now.
Thank you for that. That's really great. We're on Main Arm Creek and just up from Sherry's Bridge, and some very isolated giant canthers have been ripped off the bank and they're right across the bank, so they're pushing that water flow out, and we're concerned we're on an MO and we've got one way in and that's being eroded quite quickly with those big giant root balls high in the ceiling. Wondering what can be done when you see things happening like that.
Look, snags are a good one. I'm glad you raised it because I didn't cover it in the talk. So, I'm just going to give you a bit of background, but basically, especially if it's a native snag, it's protected under the Fisheries Management Act. I'm not the one that decides if it should be moved or reorientated. You need to talk to fisheries specifically about that. Now, if, for example, they gave you permission to reorientate it, it would generally mean root wide upstream and the rest of the trunk pointing downstream and tucked up against the bank as much as possible. They also sometimes suggest, but again, this is a camphor, we don't want to lose roughness, and so we don't really want to take that out of the system, but maybe there's a way that you can cut it up and it can break apart and become less of an issue. But you've got to talk to fisheries because as soon as you put an excavator in there and touch that bed, you need a permit.
Just on vegetation, our creek bank has a lot of camphor laurels. When we first bought, the council requested that we remove a certain number every year, and now they don't seem to require that anymore. But how does camphor as roughness on the creek bed affect the fish and everything else that's in the water?
We've done studies in the Arara, and like camphor versus no camphor, very low invertebrate communities, no camphor, very high. Now, if you've got very low invertebrate communities, you're probably going to have a lowered food source for fish. But they also, that leaf actually promotes a chemical response in the water, which fish don't like either. The camphor conversion can take a while. So we do a lot of that, but we look at it as a 10-year kind of process. And the method generally is to kind of pick an area that's manageable, right? And work on that space and gradually expand that out and link it up with other little spots.
So you wouldn't leave camphor cut down on the creek bank as roughage?
If for example, that they're dead set against them, we would ask that you cut them off at knee or waist height, poison the stump so you don't, but leave them in situ. Don't try and rip them out, for God's sake, and gradually replace them over time. Thinking though that once you take out that canopy, weeds are going to come up, so you're going to have to start managing that process pretty quickly.
Having cut a few down, I've noticed in this flood that I guess it's scouring where the rainforest trees that were completely covered previously by a lot of leaf mulch, was very thick canopy, all the roots are at the surface now, and there seems to be very little soil to plant like lavender between them or whatever. So then what?
Look, I think with that, pinworks or other features are going to provide the means for the roughness element for you to build up that organic layer again. There's so many different examples, and look, good managers like yourself, don't beat yourself up, because this is a completely different event to what we've ever seen before. The fact that we're seeing exposed kind of surface material that we probably would never see is a pretty good indication that discharge way exceeded even the natural forces of resistance, okay? So the only way to get material back is to provide a means for it to drop out and slow down. So roughness is still your friend. Whatever you've got to do, sometimes in your case it might be perpendicular to flow, do as many rows of lamandra as you can.
What about star pickers? I mean, we're really, all the lamandra kind of was taken out in this, so can you do anything like that?
Look, you'll always have losses of trees. Don't give up, keep planting. Just keep planting. And look, when revegetation's like a low cost, high risk, and takes time, as opposed to what I'm talking about, which is high cost, low risk. But different scenarios with different horses for different courses.
I want to ask a really practical question, because everything that you've presented is so motivating, but it's also so overwhelmingly terrifying. We sold up here in September to do riparian repair out on the Richmond River, because as you would know, it's extremely wounded and it's terrible now. We've got 700 metres of river stretch, and there's just two of us, and we thought we'd plot away at this over 10 years. And now we're not even sleeping at night because it's, the whole thing slipped, and I'm sure that goes almost all the way up to the headwaters. So in terms of help, like what help is available in terms of both finances as well as physical help?
And look, I'm sure everyone's got the same kind of question too. Firstly, I think, like I was saying to our friend here, it's like keep trying. The other one is try and bring your resources together. In Immigrant Creek, as part of our succession for that project, once we move away, we're trying to organise landholders into their own little pseudo-landcare groups. There's power in numbers. There's assistance, obviously, through our 1300 number to give you some guidance, but local landcare is always... Look, I would definitely be looking at landcare in the first instance, and I'd be definitely trying to get my neighbours involved. With a reach plan, with not just a single landholder, but with multiple landholders applying for buckets, that's always looked at more favourably than the individual on one outside bend. And so trying to get a reach scale plan together is really where you want to try and be to get money. And it's not easy, and you've got to have like-minded people, but that's generally where we see success for what would otherwise be individual landholders caught out across the landscape. And of course, there's so much online. Like, go and read, get those guidelines, learn as much as you can, read your river and start interpreting it after each flood event. It's an observational science, everyone can do it.
Thank you very much, Sean. It was so informative. Thank you. Taking us into lunch, we have Mark Dunphy from Firewheel Nursery, who's well known in the area. He has extensive experience in growing and planting for revegetation. And Stuart McDonald, who's a guru when it comes to restoration of native vegetation. Please welcome them.
Well, I'm completely blown away by that, Sean. I think we need a few minutes to absorb that. But so a lot of my questions were answered by that, and we're going to have a bit of repetition. So our very amateurish presentation is going to look a bit ordinary compared to that. But what we will focus on is the species and some local stories and some local things. But I'll have some repeats, which I'll just flick through because that's the slideshow. I've been looking around since the floods, downstream, upstream, and I had a tour with Stu the other day in the upper catchment and was pretty blown away by what I saw up there. And I thought Stu should come and talk about the upper catchment stuff because he's probably the most experienced regenerator in those upper catchment areas between everybody here. And but we also have a lot of experienced people here, and I'm hoping that we can have some sort of discussion. There's a lot of knowledge. We've got some species lists at the end that we're working on. And so we're hoping to distribute those and people can add their input and we'll get them distributed once we've got some input from you guys. I went to the Lismore event that was like this, and the thing that made me quite sort of shocked really was that you would have thought after 150 years of floods and slips that we would have sort of this worked out. Well, there isn't actually that much around. Sean obviously knows a huge amount of information. There is some written material, but locally we haven't really worked it out. And so this is our attempt, and I'm hoping to get some input from you guys. So I'm just going to do a quick little bit, and then Stu's going to talk and then about the upper catchment, and then I'll talk about the lower catchment. All right, so next slide. So we already know this, but I've been going around and some people actually don't think that plants help. There's landowners, there's machine drivers that I speak to, and so we all obviously know this now, but I just wanted to quickly go through at a more sort of on a finer level and say you've got the above ground parts of the plant, they help. So this is a good example where someone's put down turf and the water has gone right up to that top of that wall there, and the turf has held and the water's gone across it, and that garden bed there, it's scoured out that topsoil down to subsoil, and all that's gone, and then the lomandras have held. So we've got grasses, ground covers and ferns being the up part, and then the next slide is a natural forest that shows you how plants stop the splash erosion. So we talked, there's water moving across the landscape through creeks and by moving down the slopes, but it also, splash erosions is very important, and so a natural forest that has layers on layers and layers with the water falling slows it down, and the ferns and the leaves on the rocks slow the water down. So these are the above ground parts of the plant that are useful. And the next slide. And then of course there's the roots and the rhizomes. So on the right hand side, we have a cheese tree, Glaucidium ferdinandi, which is incredibly useful with its fibrous roots. And you'll see many trees don't have as fibrous roots as that. And so that is holding the soil for water running across the slope and the splash erosion. And that's a sandpaper fig. And that they have a bit of a mixed record in our observation in the last few months. They tend to grow on pretty rocky spots, and so a lot of them got washed away. But they don't have a very fibrous root system, but they have an extensive root system that get into rocks and hold themselves. That one held itself on just, but a lot of them were washed away, and that's usually because they're in a very very vulnerable positions on surface rock with very little soil. Okay. There's some blue quandongs, and these have been the heroes of the flood event. That is my creek there with 2 planted blue quandongs, which are they're less than 10 years old. And the next slide, please. And they're the same trees after the flood, and you can see the buttressing and the density of the roots, and they've actually held that bank. I couldn't get a very good shot, but where I'm standing, it's been gouged in. And on the other side, it's been gouged. And so this is sort of now turning into a bit of a peninsula where these very strong trees have held up against the floods. And you'll see many more pictures in our presentation of how fantastic blue quandongs are. Okay? And then this is a flood photo of what it actually used to look like in the floodplains around here, where nature's strategy is to have a lot of plants. So yes, the flood goes through, the leaves and the topsoil gets washed, but because of the density of plants, the buttressing in the bottom left-hand corner, they hold that mass of roots that Sean was talking about, that connecting mat of roots. And so although the flood would go through at a couple of metres there, the density of plants is holding everything together. And so we plant generally at about 1.8 metre spacings, and that's about 3,300 trees a hectare. These are about 25 centimetres apart. That makes 160,000 trees a hectare. So that's the density of the stems in a natural lowland subtropical rainforest. Okay, obviously trees are helping. So it was interesting, we were talking about whether they're too heavy and they're causing erosion by the trees falling, by the weight of them. Well, there's a little example where, is the tree helping, or is it going to be a problem? It looks like it's helping on the top side there. Okay, next. And there's a well-rooted large tree that's holding that slip from falling, so the roots, and we don't know, that's the question, what is a deeply rooted tree? When trees fall over in the bush, generally that's got a flat bottom. And whether they're a big fig or whether they're a rainforest tree or whether they're a eucalypt, you tend to just see that flat bottom tree. And my understanding is that trees grow with a bit of a taproot to start with, and then over time all that nutrient and all that water is on the surface, and so they just put all their effort into the surface, and so they've got these flat roots. So what has a taproot and what doesn't? We don't actually know, but that would be good to find out. That looks like, okay, and now so that's, that is a little bit of a geography lesson we're all on the same page with that, but now we wanted to talk about specific areas, the upper catchment. Go, take it away, Stu.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks to everyone else who spoke. It's, amazing, complex. I haven't quite got my head around everything just right yet. This is just a picture of upper catchments. Most of the work I do is bush regeneration up Goonengerry, Wilson's Creek, Huonbrook. I was just showing that that's about a 300 hectare patch, and there's probably 50, 60, 100 landslips on that patch, so pretty common up there. One of the reasons Mark and I are going to talk differently, I'm talking about the upper catchments, very different to the lower catchments. Problems are different, solutions are different. In the upper catchments, a lot steeper, a lot more prone to slips. The creeks are a lot steeper, a lot rockier, more defined flows, faster flows, and the vegetation, a lot more vegetation, a lot less wide open areas, a lot more diverse vegetation. We've been walking around. So this is the patch in Huonbrook I've walked past now for years, and I've looked at it. I don't know, it's not the best photo. There's rocks in the middle of it, and I've just walked past it going, yeah, cool, rocks, bit of something different, bit of different habitat for something. What we're seeing now is we're looking at these landslips and what they look like when they're brand new. When I see that now, you kind of go, okay, that's an old landslip. There's a rock deposition there, you've got the shape of the country above it. And from the age of the vegetation growing there, it looks about 50 years old, might coincide with the 1974 floods. And the more you look around the landscape, that sort of situation's everywhere, really common. So this has all happened before. We can look in the past and try and get some answers. The landscape now, especially the vegetation now, is different to what it was, but we can use it as a guide. Once again, in Huonbrook, truckloads of damage up in these upper catchments. There's a lot we can do, but I think the first thing we need to do is recognise that every bit of creek bank's different, every landslip's different, different steep, different size, different vegetation around, and on the landslip you've got the subsoil, you've got sort of this stuff, and then you've got this deposited big trees and big rocks. Down the bottom of there's black butts which are wider than that. So chaos. The vegetation you're looking at there is sort of about 8-10 years old, was a lantana 10 years ago. So the management for that would be different again. Goonengerry. Then you've got creeks. We've seen photos of devastation in the Tweed, incredible photos. 100 metres downstream from that photo, the creek completely changed course. That's Cooper's Creek. But here you've got, a good native vegetation, but you've also got a lot of weed vegetation. The next three photos, there's a few things to talk about. Can we skip forward and skip back? Yeah. Yeah? Awesome. So this is a landslip on Wilsons Creek Road. The vegetation is pretty weedy, a lot of lantana at the bottom, at the top, some pine trees, some camphor, some mixed native vegetation, and on the far side some kahali ginger, which is, you can call it toilet brush plant because it's disgusting. The next slide. This is only 100 metres up the road, same size, same shape, same aspect. The vegetation surrounding the landslip is a little bit better. This is about 5 years old, nothing's been done, and we can see some pine trees, some camphor laurel, grasses. On the slip up the top, on the subsoil, there's mosses and ferns beginning to colonise. You've also got eucalypts and wattles. Next slide. This is an extra 100 metres up the road, so it's a really good example. You've got a brand new slip, 5-year-old slip, and a 10-year-old slip, all within a couple 100 metres of each other. You can see on the way they're behaving at the back of the slip, there's the ferns and mosses have really established themselves, beginning to create an organic layer, and trees are beginning to germinate on that, what was completely subsoil. Wattles, eucalypts, a little bit of lantana, but bugger all weeds. And that's mainly because the surrounding vegetation was, there wasn't pine trees and there wasn't camphor in that surrounding vegetation. Okay, so what are we going to do? There's a few options. First thing is to recognise that everything's different. You have to put thought into everything. There's the do nothing, and we've just seen 3 slides where nothing was done. 5 years, 5 years, 10 years. There's a do nothing, that's fraught with danger. There's a lot of understanding of soil movement and that, which I don't understand. But a lot of understanding of what vegetation's around, what seed input's going to go in there. There's the weed, there's the plant, and there's broadcast seed, direct seed, introduced seed. So this is a slip up in Huonbrook. You can see it's surrounded by, pretty nice vegetation. There were really big black butts there, really big bloodwoods there. There's a big tamarind up on the far side of the photo. So rainforest underneath so it was good vegetation. Anyway, it's slipped, and if we go to the next photo, this is what we're looking at now. This is what the ground on that slip looks like. So do you do nothing? Do you plant? Do you weed? Or do you introduce seeds? This is about a 30, this is just a little area. I can see a tremor. Yep. Native pioneer shrub lives for about 5 years. I can see a pencil cedar, brown currajongs. So they're native pioneer trees that live for sort of 25, 30 years. And a red cedar, native pioneer tree, lives for over 1,000 years. So there's, 10 native tree seedlings there already. All right, let's walk away, job done. Maybe not. We can also see tobaccos, and that's a flea-bane and annual. So one thing that we're noticing, so all of that seed, red cedar maybe is the exception, whether it's tobacco, brown currajong, tremor, or pencil cedar, all of that seed has a viability in the soil for 30, 40, 50 plus years. So when we do the camphor conversion, the lantana conversion to rainforest, this is basically what we're doing. We're trying to simulate this natural disturbance, trying to simulate a tree fall in a rainforest, trying to simulate a landslide. Don't need to do that anymore. And get light hitting the soil to try and germinate that seed bank. So we've got all this fantastic native regeneration. When you look at how the size of the brown currajong, the size of the pencil cedar, the size of the tremor, and you look at the size of the tobaccos and how fast they're growing, I'm going to back the tobaccos to win that. And in 3-4 years' time, it'll be a 95% gap of pure tobacco. They'll outgrow these light-loving native trees, shade them out, and kill them. So weeding, fantastic. What a great option to go with now. Planting is always really tricky. Why wouldn't you? No reason to not plant there if you've got the energy. If you were to plant, you would be aiming to increase diversity. So plant species which aren't going to get them by themselves. Plant species which are ecologically really important. So some of your mature phase laurels, which your wampu fruit doves are going to love. Some of your big fruited plants which aren't going to get there because their dispersers aren't in the landscape anymore. I know the owner of this property, he's really keen, and I've heard this a lot of times from people up in Huonbrook and up in Wilson's Creek. He's really keen to plant some hoop pine at the top of this slip. Hoop pine, from what I'm seeing and from what I'm hearing, has done a really good job holding soil back. Broadcast seed is easy. We look around at the moment, red apples are fruiting. Grab a chunk of red apples, big red fruit, go and chuck them in there. It might take you 5 minutes. And if you do 100, 10 might live. Fantastic. Good 5 minutes work. Kahali ginger. If no one knows how bad Kahali ginger is, go home, Google Kahali ginger in Hawaii, and you'll see pictures of fields of Kahali you can't walk through, growing on cliffs, growing in the tops of trees, destroying entire islands. This is, I hate Kahali ginger. It's got a flower that everyone loves, but I think it looks like a toilet brush, so we should spread that around. But this is an example where there's opportunities to get in there now. Now these disturbances have happened, there's opportunities to get in there, treat the weeds to really encourage the native trees. So we've got that opportunity. The weeds have also got that opportunity. So whether it be a ginger or a taro or a white, like Kahali or white ginger, taro getting broken up in the floods and distributed down the creek and deposited somewhere, whether it be Kahali ginger like this with a big open patch and extra sunlight and bare dirt where it can do its thing. So the weeds have got their opportunity, so it's a pretty good time to try and get on top of them. Next one, Ellie. So that's below that patch of Kahali. There were numerous, there were heaps of them. Little bits of broken ginger down on that lower bit of slip, and they're all shooting, and do nothing, and we'll have a Kahali nightmare. So a few plants, I think Mark's going to touch on this more, in the upper catchment, which have proven to be really successful in the floods. This is a blue quandong. Like Mark said, they're the big winners. Lamandra on the ground. That blue quandong's got scars from previous floods of things smashing into it 4 metres off the ground. Here we go again, middle of Wilson's Creek, small blue quandong. Everything else is washed away, but that's kind of handled. The other plants in the middle of that creek there, Lamandra, water gum, and creek lily pilly. And here, once again, here's back to that opportunity that both we have and the weeds have. So we have an opportunity now with the Kahali ginger there, all the small leaf rivet smashed over. We can go and treat that pretty quickly and easily now that it's sort of smashed down. And in that sort of situation, there's all the extra light, so if we don't do that, then the weeds are going to take advantage of that. That situation where you've got decent forest behind you, you've got a whole lot of smashed forest on the, flattened forest on the smash zone, except for the blue quandong and even the palms behind the blue quandong. Blue quandongs are absolute winners. So the blue quandongs will save the palms behind. If you can get rid of those weeds, you'll find that trees from inside have got broken roots, so they'll sucker up, send up a new one. You'll find seeds have been washed down and deposited, waiting for a chance to grow. They've got their chance now. If you can get rid of those weeds won't be out competing those native trees. Yeah, I think that'll do. So there's a lot of work to do, opportunities to do it. It's hard work, complex work, but yeah, good luck, everyone.
I live in macadamia world, and I can tell you there are truckloads of topsoil disappearing off our macadamia, which I prefer cows any day to a macadamia plantation, poorly managed. My whole catchment is macadamias, and it's bad. So any forest that is single species like that with no understory, which includes a camphor forest, because most of the camphor forest doesn't have much under it, we're losing a lot of topsoil from there. Weed impaction and low native seedling. So different to the upper catchment where Stu lives and works, which is to me like luxury. You've got this massive forest there, you've got this huge damage, and nature is repairing it with a little bit of help from us. Here we've got you go to the next slide maybe, we've got a couple of minutes. So we've seen a million shots of creeks, but in the background it shows you camphors are starting to take over there. There's a little bit of native vegetation. There's a red apple and a pepperberry and an aphananthe there, a native elm, and obviously heaps of rank erosion that goes for hundreds of kilometres. Okay. So the do-nothing approach, which Stu says will end up with weeds, with the lower catchment areas. This is these people, nothing's going to happen, right? So this is the back of someone's property, that's his tip. So he just dumps all his crap there, so there's no way he cares about regenerating this bit. We've got rock, subsoil, and a little bit of forest. And we've got lantana over here. So what's going to happen is the lantana's just going to take over this slope, which isn't such a bad thing if you're not going to do anything, because it does create a little bit of soil, a little bit of habitat, and might stop the splash erosion from the low canopy that it produces. Tons of, and down in my area, I live in Durrabee, and everywhere around there, back to Lismore, has got endless amounts of grass, steep grass. This cow farmer here, marginal slope here, quite steep. The grass barely grows there. The lantana's coming through, and they just trying to create a little bit of grass there. Well, of course, they're not going to fence it off and plant it up like they should be, but that's if you drive up the Nimbin Valley or all the valleys up around Corndale, you'll see that everywhere. Okay, next. I thought I'd do this an engineering solution here. I knew there was going to be some fantastic stuff, but nothing as fabulous as what Sean was showing. But this photo there was taken, this was taken here, was the top row. It actually came right to the top here. And there's a nice and expensive, so they're columnar basalts brought in by a low loader from Tevan, would have cost, who knows, $50,000, $100,000. So that's not going to happen, but it worked. Lamandras, rocks, geotech material behind it, and turf, and that creek is hitting it at 90 degrees. So anyway, we'll move on from that. That's it. That's on Wilson's Creek, yeah, down at Currabell, yeah. Wilson's Creek, yeah. Oh, this is my fancy graph. So I just like a visual sort of idea, but it's not really quite there yet. But the idea is that you've got a lot of disturbance. So I just want to get the idea that you've got a lot of disturbance. Oh, there's something missing there. Stop. There's supposed to be some words there, but anyway, so that's number of species. Number of species, zero number of species, zero disturbance. So you get no disturbance, you get a heap of diversity, right? So it doesn't work with every ecosystem. With our ecosystems, if you have stability, you get more and more species. And so as you get increased volume of water, velocity of water, and frequency of disturbance, you end up with, okay, we have the line now. Look at that. And so, and then you get, so the more disturbance equals the less species. So you get to the point where you've got no species. It's completely been wiped out. And then up here, very little disturbance. You can plant whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to do anything. It's all fabulous. And so the next little thing, look at that. How fancy is that? And so you just need to think in your mind that forget about it down here. Like if you've got a high frequency of disturbance and velocity and volume, don't even try and go there. It's too hard. If you're getting, a lot of floods, but you're not losing everything, you might find that here is one species. That species might be blue quandong, it might be lamandra, it might be small leaf privet, and then you can then work with those species. I'm trying to get an idea that you have a very restricted species list that you can use in very extreme situations. Don't go for diversity. Just go for one species if you need to, or 4 or 5 species. All right, we're going to get to the species. So here's an example down at the Channon. There's one species survived. This is Callistemon viminalis. So that is a very disturbed creek line there. That water has gone right over those banks. It's full of weeds. The weed impaction is extreme. There's a lot of floods go down there regularly. And so Sean was sort of saying, keep trying. But Stu and I are saying, don't keep trying, because failure ends up with failure. I work at the nursery. People come to me every day and they say, oh, no, they don't say this every day, but people say, oh, it must be great for you. Oh, you get, a big flood, all your plants are washed away, then people have to buy more. And then you get another flood, and then the plants get washed away and they have to buy more. No, it doesn't work like that at all. It's success breeds success. So if you've got a property and you've got a high disturbance zone, start up here. Start somewhere where you get success, and success breeds success. And then you get more experience, and then you work your way down into the high velocity going. When you're experienced and you're like Sean and you do it every day, or you're like some of us regenerators in this room, and we can sort of work out, okay, well, let's try this, and you're going to get setbacks. But if you're a landowner who's put in a lot of money and effort and you get failure, you're not going to come back. You're just going to abandon it and move down to the coast and enjoy a walk on the beach with your dog. So we need people to have success, and planting anywhere near there is going to breed failure. So whoever planted those ukes up there, they're a success, and they mightn't be the right species for there, but they're actually working. So the message for us is to make sure whatever you're doing is going to work, and then work into the difficult zones. Have I got any more slides? Yeah, so 5 minutes. Oh, I'm talking way too fast. I could slow down. Yeah, so Sean talked a lot about the engineering solutions here. So this is down at Repentance Creek, and where Minion Falls Creek came right over the road and hit Cooper's Creek and gouged out about 100 metres of bank. Huge amount of damage down there if anyone's been over those bridges. So the question is, the reality is, Sean's got all these fantastic ideas which, you know, we should all use. But as a landowner, what are you going to do? You're going to get these approvals and get help. That would be fantastic. What you really want to do is something like tomorrow. So this is the worst case scenario. What are you going to do? Stick lamandras in the side of that bank, down on the water's edge or up the top, and trees? Well, I don't know about you, but I've been down Cooper's Creek and Wilson's Creek in a kayak, and I've seen plenty of people attempting to plant trees on their bank, and they might be, you know, 5 to 10 years old, thick as your leg at least, and they're all falling into the creek because either there's one, they haven't planted wide enough, like further enough away, which is what Sean was talking about, and they haven't planted close enough, so they haven't got that mat of roots happening. They've got one single tree here and one over there. So the density of plantings is really important, and then the species list that we want to talk about next. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. So this is a little bit of success. So the other thing we really wanted to talk about was endemic versus non-endemic versus exotic. So this is at below Corndale Hall, which is no more, as you might know, floated away. It just floated away over the top of these trees, just a little further down. This one on the far right here is Waterhousia. So Waterhousia did not occur there. It occurred further down the stream past Lismore, but it is a winner. It's a winner. It's in our lower catchment here in Brunswick. And so I'm pushing it further upstream. It's not endemic to there, but it's pretty close. It's got really fibrous roots. It's fantastic. The Casuarina cunninghamiana is also not there. That's also a winner. Then there's plenty of other species that we've planted that have worked. But the flood went way over the top of those trees, and they've held. There's the hoop pines, which are a winner, especially on slopes, have been a little bit difficult here. I think if they were another 5 years older, they would have been fantastic, but they somehow caught a lot of debris and a lot of them got knocked over. So that's a bit of a disappointment because they, as you know, they're a bit slow to get going. Yeah, did it? Yeah, yeah. You can see the bigger one was sort of handled it, but that one on the left is, yeah. Okay, next. Right, so mid-catchment creek. So we didn't do an upper catchment planting. I started doing one and it became problematic because Stu's like, regenerate first, see what comes up. Very, very small species list for the high, and okay, next species list. Oh, look, you can enlarge it. Wow. So you can't see this one. So this is a lower catchment creek, so it's more species, but we've got grasses there, carex, and there's a range of trees there. So I've cut out heaps of things, and I've mostly the frost-sensitive stuff, but there's Waterhousia there, there's figs. There's a lot of species that are slow growing, and you need to mix them with the mediums and then the fast. So we've got to hold the soil, hold it initially, and those shallow-rooted things are often the fast-growing things are often the shallow-rooted things, and the slow-growing things are often the deep-rooted things. So doesn't work that out. And then there's mid to lower slips. Now this is a slips list. So again, same thing. Make sure you cover the ground. Stop the splash erosion, stop the water moving, slow the water down, and then we've got pioneers. So pink ash isn't necessarily a deep rooter, but it's going to cover the ground and hold the soil, and then the long-lived things like the hard quandongs and the figs and the brush box are going to. So they're just a list. So hopefully we can develop that with all you guys. Okay, thank you.
I'm on Upper Cooper's Creek, probably about 2 k's downstream from Stu's photo. My problems have been quite different. I've lost at least 2 quandongs like that, maybe even bigger. Yeah, and one of them came out whole bolus and disappeared. The other one you can still see. The bottom of the roots is still in the ground, but the remainder of the tree is up in a slash pine. The slash pines were amazingly resilient and actually protected the rainforest. I don't think I lost any of them.
Which are?
Slash pines. Yeah. Oh, really? They weren't actually in the major flow, but they certainly had water because I've got a photo of them, you know. Yeah. So my main problem, as far as I can see, was logs coming down and knocking old trees out. And the medium-sized quandongs, most of them are ring-barked 3 or 4 metres up the trunk. So I suppose I'll have to shoot from the base if they're going to do anything in the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the message there is that, you know, I show photos of creek banks which are, you know, with a little bit of effort we can have a big impact. Your creek bank's going to be different, so every site's going to be different. What Mark was trying to talk about with his fantastic graph, the smash zone.
What data was it based on?
What I call the smash zone, so which is that, you know, where the flood zone along creeks.
Yeah.
It's a really hard place to work. So, you know, even if you've got lantana coming down to the creek, and we treat all camphor, we treat all the lantana, we germinate the soil stored seed bank, and grow a rainforest, that's lovely. We're on the creek, bank in the smash zone, the seed bank's not there, and if you do germinate something, the next flood, which is 6 months away or 2 years away, washes that away. So it's a really tricky thing. What I tend to do is move it just adjacent to the smash zone and grow those trees. And there were some photos there with trees which are 8 years old and they're growing really well. They're sort of 30 foot tall now.
Well,
grow those trees, create that canopy.
Better have a look, I think, Stu, because you know, I also lost several hundred palms that were about 6 metres high.
Yeah.
All self-germinated.
Yeah.
And they were sort of up to about 15 metres away from the creek line.
Okay, that's still in the smash zone. It's a really tricky place. It's a really tricky place to work. I think one of the other messages Duff was trying to get across was instead of going, you know, we've got these, you know, 150 fantastic species of native trees, all beautiful, great to put them all in. Instead of doing that, let's step back and plant 1 or 2 species. I remember working with Mark 20 plus years ago, you know, brand new up here, and he said rule number 1 is plant a tree that's going to live. And that's pretty good.
So that's the other question I've got. Of all the trees I've planted on the riparian zone, I can name the successes on one hand.
Yeah.
And I would have planted, what, about 50, I suppose, you know?
Yeah, and so were those species on that?
Yeah, they probably were. Yeah, I would say they were. But it's, you know, it's all these other factors that come into play. And also the planted trees don't have the root system that a self-germinated tree has. So you're better off, as far as I'm concerned, is to weed and foster the stuff that's coming up naturally. Yeah.
But the trees are great until they start moving.
Yeah.
And then they just form all these problems. So, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Thank you to all the Landcare groups for putting this on. I hope you have a lovely afternoon and enjoy your weekend. And here's to some sun. Thank you.
Just quickly, mangroves, you can plant them this deep, so they don't get washed out in the flood.